So picture this, you're driving down the road, you're paying real close attention, there's no obstructions, no visibility issues, and all of a sudden you hit a big old pothole or you hit a curb. Listen, we know it's not your fault, but the problem is your steering angle went from here to go straight, or here. Doesn't matter. I mean, it could be any which way, but the fact of the matter is curb strike damage or pothole damage is a really, really common thing because, well, let's be honest, most of the roads in the United States and throughout the world actually are kind of not that great. So it is possible to happen, and we absolutely know that it's not your fault and there's nothing that you can do to avoid it, but you do want to repair the damage. So we have an example here today on the lift of some curb strike damage. We're going to go through the diagnosis process and how to identify which parts are damaged, which parts absolutely need to be replaced. And even if you're not doing this yourself, it is important to know the fundamentals on this so that even if you're having somebody else do the work for you, you can be on the same page as them. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at this car and see if we can find the damage on this and what we're going to need to do to fix it. So I think the most obvious place to start on this is to look at the wheel and the tire. A lot of modern wheels are cast, so it's cast aluminum, very lightweight relatively speaking, and relatively strong, but with larger diameter wheels and lower profile tires, damage is more likely to happen to the wheels. So bending, cracking, things like that, these are things to look out for. You can have a cracked wheel and it still hold air. So it is important to inspect this over, make sure there isn't any structural damage to the wheel. In this case, it's superficial damage, which I think the owner of this car probably is going to want to replace this wheel because obviously that doesn't look too nice. You also want to look at the tire. There's quite a bit of scuffing here from where it looks like it went over the curb. So you can kind of see it there. That isn't really structural damage of the tire, but these tires are also a little bit worn too, so probably wouldn't be a bad idea to replace them. But what you're looking for is any kind of notable damage on the tire, any kind of notable structural damage on the wheel, and this is really the best place to start first. That is, of course, if you still have the wheel attached to the car. If you're unlucky and the wheel has just yeeted out of there and it's gone, you're gonna have to replace this altogether anyway, so that doesn't really matter. But now we talked about this, so let's go ahead and look at the suspension and see what we can find on that end of things. All right, so depending on the car that you drive, all of this stuff here could look entirely different. So this being an E92 rear-wheel drive car, it's got a thrust arm, a wishbone, and a tie rod. In this car's particular case, the steering is definitely off, and so one of the common things that's gonna happen on a lot of modern cars is if the steering angle is constantly, you know, out of range basically, or what the ABS picks up is out of range, your ABS and stability control will probably turn off, because if you need to constantly drive down the road like this, ABS will deactivate. One thing to note is on a lot of cars, newer cars with electric steering racks, if you have something that's bent in the suspension and you have to basically steer or counter steer for a long period of time, what'll happen is the car's onboard electronics will see that you have to do a constant steering input, and it'll basically reset the steering angle back to center. So you can actually drive the car on bent suspension components and not even know, because the car has basically adapted to the fact that you constantly have to do a steering input to keep the car going straight. And that could wreak havoc later on, because if the, you know, damage is repaired, some shops, alignment shops, don't actually know that you have to reset the steering angle for the electric steering rack to know that everything is now straight ahead. It will relearn on its own, but that's an electric steering rack specific issue. But most notably, your ABS will probably turn off and your stability will probably turn off if you have to constantly drive with some kind of steering input to go straight. And that's more of a safety issue than anything else. What we're looking for here is obvious signs of damage on the suspension. I can already tell there is a slight bend in the tie rod, and this is going to be the first thing that bends on pretty much any suspension, because this right here, particularly the inner tie rod end, is very thin, and this is designed to basically be a mechanical fuse. When they design this stuff in the factory, all this stuff needs to be able to bend to prevent further damage from the car and also absorb the impact. So outside of that, you know, the wishbone right here, this is a weak area, this can bend. The thrust arm, there's a very thin area here, this can bend. Another thing to note, particularly on your rear-wheel drive E90s, is the knuckle is cast aluminum. It's a very lightweight piece, but depending on the severity of the impact, you could have damage where the strut goes through up here. Also, the wheel bearing is another area to look at. If the impact is severe enough, it can damage the ball bearings inside the wheel bearing. And if that's not something that is replaced, you might find later on that there is actually something wrong with the wheel bearing. On this car's particular case, the magnetic ring for the ABS system is actually in the wheel bearing, so it is possible for that ring to have been damaged during the impact. So sometimes you will have to replace the wheel bearing just to deal with that issue altogether. Another thing to note here as well, depending on the severity of the impact, there is a little tab here on the strut. If you hit a pothole, for example, it could force this tab to bend and the strut to come down. In that case, the knuckle would have to be replaced because it's basically being forced through. So again, cast aluminum piece, that is something to be aware of. Another thing to note as well is you want to look at the subframe. Again, this is an aluminum subframe, so it is possible for the side impact to damage these mounting points for the control arms, and that's something you want to be aware of as well. If you see any kind of sign that these bolts have moved or shifted, the subframe is damaged, and that's probably going to have to be replaced as well. That would be a really serious impact though, and there's probably going to be a lot of other structural damage to the car, so that's not too common. Another thing to note as well, possible steering rack damage. If the bump was hard enough to force the pinion inside the steering rack, there could be internal damage on the steering rack as well. The only way to really figure out if there's some kind of end damage or seal damage is you have to pop this boot off. If you see an excessive leak, that could have been there already, but that would be grounds to replace the steering rack as well. And another thing that you want to look at too is BMW is pretty good with this. Different car manufacturers have different ways of mounting front subframes or subframes of the car. These are pretty much piloted, so the subframe can only go on one way. But if you saw a notable shift of the subframe on the frame rail of the car, basically that would suggest that everything has been moved over to a side. You're gonna have some alignment problems even after repair work has been done for some of these external components, but you could also potentially have some frame damage on that. Again, that would be a very severe impact, and you probably have other signs or other issues that would stand out immediately as things that need to be addressed. But primarily what you're looking for in all of this is you want to identify the things that are completely damaged, and you want to identify other things that could have been affected by the impact. So your wheel bearings, your control arms, the steering rack, the tie rods, the subframe, all these components are connected to one another, so you want to make sure that there isn't damage that has been transferred to another part of the car. Obviously, we're looking at the front suspension. Rear suspension is going to be a little bit different. You don't have the steering component aspect of that, but you could have a situation where components in the rear suspension are bent, causing a toe out or a camber problem, so that's another area that you want to look at as well. But generally speaking, the front suspension is the most sensitive to these impacts, just because you also have the steering components and everything else. But depending on where the car was hit, or which corner took the brunt of the impact, you'd want to inspect that and make sure that there isn't a lot of external damage or damage that has been shifted to another side of the car. So we've already assessed the damage on this car, and honestly, it just looks like a tie rod has been affected, but there's a lot of high mileage components on here, and we're gonna go ahead and replace actually several other things: control arms, wheel bearing, also the wheel carrier or steering knuckle, just because it is an aluminum piece and it's not really worth taking the risk since it's relatively cheap. So we're gonna have several different DIY videos addressing those repairs. So we'll go ahead and link that in the description if you're interested in seeing the follow-up on this. So we know that these incidents are actually a lot more common than people really want to talk about, and we know that some of these stories can be a little bit sensitive, but we'd like to see your story or hear your story, whether it was a curb strike, a pothole, or road debris damage. I have my own story from a long time ago, so I'm gonna share it because I think it's pretty interesting how it all played out. So once this video is published, I'm gonna drop my story in the description, and I'd love to see your stories as well. But with that said, if you do have any other questions, go ahead and drop it in the comment box below. We'll get back to you. Hit that like button if you like this video, and hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.